Mr. Maimane, thank you so much for joining us on ENCA this evening. Before we start our conversation, I want to rejig your memory and I want us to watch this clip.
And that's why I simply don't agree with those who say that they don't see color. Because if you don't see that I'm black, then you don't see me at all.
This was you, Mr. Maimane, at the DA's elective conference in Port Elizabeth in 2015. You had just been appointed as the party's first black leader. Why was it so important for you to make that statement and make it known that you want to be recognized as black?
Good evening, and good evening to fellow South Africans. I think the history of our nation is filled with a struggle between one race being oppressed over another. We've gone through colonialism, we've gone through apartheid, and that, for me, as a black South African, connects me with a deeper history of many Africans who have struggled. It also enjoins me to those who want to build a reconciled nation, such as President Nelson Mandela, who said he opposes black domination and white domination. It introduces me to the 1994 consensus of our constitution that South Africa shall belong to all of those who live in it, black and white. So to me, these are sentiments that speak deeply to identity, speak to the fact that my race connects me to a history of this country, and furthermore, that ultimately to identify me as black is not to be racist, but to celebrate the diversity of our nation and where we've come from. And therefore, it becomes very important that you cannot disassociate my race from the very identity I hold.
Does it surprise you that the party has resolved at its policy conference to reject racial classification? Where did you stand on this when you were still the leader of the party? I mean, at the time, this was just a mere policy proposal.
This was fundamental to the issue that led me to my departure from the DA. When I led the DA, I made it very clear that I wanted to build a nation upon which black and white could work together to fight against systems that exclude a particular race. And that war is not one race versus another. That war is a system that has allowed, in the last centuries and decades, many black South Africans to be left out of economic opportunities. Many of them, through a function of the history of our country, have been left to live outside economic participation, educational opportunities. But that is not a war. That is a system. That is something that all of us must commit ourselves to working together towards achieving. For if we fail to do that, then there cannot be peace in this country, because ultimately inequality will continue to prevail on racial terms. And so when I made that proposal, it wasn't to suddenly put one race against another. I truly believe that there could be that leading party that brings all South Africans together to fight this battle. And that was a continual fight to say, let's identify this injustice, let's fight hard against it, and let's come up with policies that bring redress, that address historical injustice. But clearly, when you take away the idea that race can be a factor of consideration, then what you ultimately then argue for is that maybe a community like Khayelitsha isn't a community that was designed by the apartheid government in Group Areas Act for black people to live in. It just simply becomes, as others would put it, just a community of poor people. And I think that's lazy, that's not good enough. I think that we must do more. And because the last number of years we've seen a government that has failed to achieve this redress, does not mean that the very question of redress is still necessary. Because ultimately, if we want to build one South Africa, which is a vision I hold and I'm now pursuing, we have to address this injustice so we build a South Africa.
So what is the party and the people who think race is not a proxy for disadvantage not getting here? Because it appears they think to recognize race is to be racist. Is it even possible to acknowledge that black people were disadvantaged by the apartheid system and were systematically locked out of opportunities, that race shaped their identities and opportunities, and then not want to recognize race as a factor when dealing with redress?
I think for some people, they would judge the implementation of legislation that has tried to address this issue as almost the only benchmark we can use to be able to achieve the addressing of historical injustice. I'll be the first one. In fact, I was the first leader in the DA who stood up publicly in Parliament and said, I think that we need to scrap triple BEE. But that did not become synonymous with saying that we must scrap redress. Because how you achieve redress can take many routes, of which triple BEE is one, but there can be many others. Why are we not deliberate about saying some of the measures that we ought to be looking at is how do we, in fact, advantage from an asset transfer point of view? How do we ensure that shareholding amongst many South Africans, particularly black South Africans, is achieved so that intergenerational wealth is something that moves from one generation to another, certainly even amongst black South Africans? And I want to assert this particular point is that this is not a war that was certainly within my circles wasn't just a question that black people were asking. It's a question that white South Africans ought to be asking. For we are not attending to another race, we are attending to a system here. And I think as a country and as a nation, what has now happened recently is that there's been a departure and an evacuating of the center of politics, where black and white South Africans want to work together. And the net consequence of this will mean that, in fact, populists will rise, people who seek to polarize us will rise. And what we've got to achieve as a nation, and this is the dream I hold, is that I can work together with citizens to build that center of black and white South Africans to charter a way for an inclusive economy for all, so that we can prosper together.
Where do you start, Mmusi? How do you go about starting that process? What's the best way, according to you, of redressing the injustices of the past and embracing non-racialism without being colorblind?
Well, I think it's a first and foremost, I think to be a denialist of race is the worst place to start. I think to acknowledge the pain, the history of people, to recognize that as we've gone through that, in this instance, black lives do matter. And that's not to suggest that they matter more than others. It's to suggest that there's an injustice that's been committed. Furthermore, you need to be able to say, what are the inequality issues that we've inherited? Some of those begin with property. How do we do asset transfer to South Africans so that they can be empowered to be able to hand over to the next generation? Secondly, how do we address the educational inequalities? Today, we can really have a fight about the racism that has occurred in the Clicks matter, but we forget how often many black kids go to schools that are substandard, and we don't take the same level of anger and aggression. I'm not saying that one justifies the other, but all racism must be condemned, but equally so, we must fight for an education system that is equitable for all citizens. And that's about making sure that we are deliberate in the lifelong learning process, offering educational opportunities for black South Africans post-matric, making sure that there's a public-private partnership that addresses poor education and poor communities. And then how do we ensure that there's enterprise development, the very notion that ultimately, in the sense of business, for many South Africans, particularly black ones who want to start businesses, don't often have venture capital. And how do we assist them? How do we, if you like, if you look at a sector like the insurance industry, we create a venture capital fund so that there can be more insurance companies and that black South Africans can participate within that sector. This is a vital intervention that says, let's redream society. Let's not have, ultimately, when one day your kids and my kids do not live in communities where we can, just by looking at the infrastructure around us, say, but this is a black community or this is a white community or this is whatever, that we can ultimately get to a point where we say, indeed, our communities, our cities, our education centers, our places of worship are diverse and are places upon which all South Africans can gather together and reconcile together to build a prosperous nation.
And maybe the conversation that we're having now is going to help and go a long way in getting people to understand those issues around race. But do you think specifically the race denial and the race denialism advances us as this society and community that is scarred from the injustices of the past, or does it take us extremely back?
I think it's a very dangerous denialism. I don't want to live in I want a society that celebrates diversity. I want to live in a society that says, I'm proud to be black. I'm proud to have hair like this, so I want to look like that. Not as a function of saying that you are going to oppress another person, but as a recognition of the God-given diversity we have. So to me, race blindness is a catchphrase that seeks to, at times, become denialist of the past. And so suddenly people are now, we're not put in areas because of Group Areas Act, that education was not a miseducation among black South Africans. It can be quickly leading towards that. And I just think if you are really conscious about addressing the challenges of South Africa, you have to realize is that the problems of South Africa were created along racial lines, and therefore interventions that you bring on the table must be able to address that question. So that one day it can be possible that all our kids will be able to celebrate their diversity and know that even in our diversity, we are still equal. You see, the mistake that someone makes is that the liberation of black South Africans is a sudden enslavement of white South Africans.
Yeah.
That is a misnomer. Actually, the liberation of black South Africans and the freeing of opportunity for more black South Africans is the liberation of all citizens in the country. Because then we achieve complete freedom, not part freedom.
Yeah. Some people have said equality to others really feels like oppression, especially those that are used to privilege. Mr. Maimane, thank you so much for your time on ENCA this evening.